literature? Okay, is it covering the skills that that other people think are important to measure? Or are you, is my checklist actually missing an item that I completely forgot about, but is absolutely critical? You need other people's input in this, and you need to document that you've gotten input on this. I think too often people try to publish all the great work they've done, and they haven't properly documented the steps they've taken to gather validity evidence, when it's quite easy to do that. And so really that's sort of content validity, is the way in which you're developing your instrument is extremely important. And I have actually not engaged in this myself personally, and perhaps you have. I think you have, Jeff, and it'd be great if you could speak about this. But a modified Delphi approach, where you're actually polling, it's almost like a poll. You're polling trusted experts in your field, in your discipline, and making sure that they feel that the steps that you've outlined in your checklist to measure a behavior adequately cover that skill. So do you have an example of a time that you've done that?
We do it all the time, actually. We use the modified Delphi by sending the checklist out to a lot of experts. And when I say experts, I use that term softly, but people that actually do the procedure frequently and will have opinions on best practices. And we'll send that to them, and they'll look at the checklist, they'll revise it. But the modified Delphi is an iterative process where you keep revising and then sending it back out to your experts. And eventually you come to a consensus. And that is, as you said, a form of content validity.
And I think it's really important to also point out, and there's a graphic that Bill McGahee, I think, helped develop in our chapter on assessment and instrument development, that what you're going to eventually include in a checklist or an assessment instrument is a sampling. It's a sample. You cannot possibly, if you were to develop a checklist that covers every single component of a learning objective or your entire curriculum, that would be a very long checklist indeed. And I think you'll talk about some unwieldy instruments out there, I'm sure, when you talk about rater training in this podcast. But it's very important that you're choosing the correct, or the items that have consensus in the field. There is a give and take. I think that there needs to be a consensus on what the most important things to assess are.
Yeah, and that's an interesting point you make about the number of items on a checklist. I really like to keep our checklist to no more than 20 to 30 items. Otherwise, they become too difficult to interpret and get good inter-rater reliability training, which kind of brings us to our next step about pilot testing and feedback, step 5. So how do we ensure that our checklists produce reliable data?
I think pilot testing can really be used for two purposes. One, to make sure that your raters are understanding and comprehending the words that you've chosen to put on your checklist, which, most of the time we write things down and we assume that people are going to interpret them the way that we do. But even using a term that's supposed to delineate frequency, like consistently, well, someone may have a different interpretation of consistency than you do. And so pilot testing with your raters and actually having them think out loud with you as they're going through it can be a really helpful exercise to ensure that your items are clear to everyone who's going to be using them. And then the second reason to do pilot testing is what you alluded to before, Jeff, about making sure that, again, that people are rating reliably, in which they're rating consistently. And I use that word consistently again, but that they're rating the same. And they're observing the behavior and rating that behavior in the same way. And so that's when you can start calculating interreliability among your raters, and making sure that the instrument is producing data that's reliable.
I'd like to add one other reason to pilot test, and that's just to make sure that your checklist actually works with the simulator, because you might have some steps that you put on there that make no sense when you actually get in the room and try them. You mentioned a little bit about statistics, and whenever the general medical doctor like me start talking about statistics, we get a little nervous. But what statistical methods can or should be used to ensure our checklists produce valid and reliable data?
So depending on the kind of instrument you have, you can produce data that will calculate inter-rater reliability. So for example, with a checklist where you might have 2 or 3 levels. So let's say you have a checklist that you're looking at a behavior or a step in a procedure, and something may be done correctly, done incorrectly, or not done. So you basically have 3 levels of that checklist. So if it's something like that, you can often use a kappa or a weighted kappa to determine how often your raters agree with each other. If you have a rubric or a rating scale that's measuring data that has, maybe it's a Likert scale 1 through 5, a kappa that measures exact agreement may not be best. You may start using something like an intra-class correlation.
And speaking of calibrating the checklist, you can use those statistical numbers like the kappa to actually revise your checklist or revise your scoring rubric to try and get those numbers more consistently high so that you have good inter-rater reliability. So we've talked a little bit about checklist design and assessment. Now I kind of want to move to program evaluation. One of the most frustrating things for me, and I know we use the term, but these terms we use in assessment, like content validity, face validity, construct validity, I could never keep them all straight. I was so relieved when a few authors, specifically Kane and Messick, designed a new form of validity argument, which is much more unified. And it's really never settled. They kind of argue that the validity argument is something that's ongoing and forever. I really like the Kane and Messick argument because I don't have to remember what face and construct and content validity are. And when I think of the Kane and Messick validity argument, I think of program evaluation and translational science. But before we get into translational science and the Kane and Messick, can you talk a little bit about your take on this model?
Yeah, I think I felt exactly the way you did, in which a lot of the validity frameworks didn't really speak to me until Messick and so I started reading and digging into what Messick and Kane were talking about, and it started to make sense to me. But I think what you mentioned, where they're basically saying, gather the evidence, create an argument. This is something I mentioned before. You need to be able to defend your decisions. You need to be able to defend the items that you've chosen to put in your checklist, and that's really all it is. Some of it is quantitative, running statistics, and some of it is what I was talking about previously with making sure that you're documenting the fact that you vetted your checklist with others, that you pilot tested it, that you received feedback, that people are able to interpret the items on your checklist, that people are able to reliably rate learners at the same level in the same way. So those are all things that you're gathering, and your little evidence toolkit or your little evidence bag, and that you can bring out when you want to show your learners that you have the evidence that this is a great curriculum and a great assessment. You may need to show your supervisor that they can trust the decisions that your sim lab is doing and making of the learners that come through it. You'll also need to absolutely show it to any journal editor if you want to be published, if you want to share your work externally. And so I think what we were talking about before in the development of the checklist is really about what Messick called sort of the content and the response validity, just making sure that it's making sense to others. And it's okay if you don't call it that. You just need to understand that your development should be documented.
Yeah, and I can't keep it straight because I think Messick had 6 components that he described. But at the same time, I like to use the translational science T1 through T4 outcomes that were described by McGahey to show the validity evidence for the Kane and Messick. So the T1 outcomes that we look at are really what happens in the laboratory. Does the individual learner learn, or does the program promote learning? Do the learners feel better about themselves, feel more confident, have better attitudes about what's going on? The T2 outcomes are more what happens in the patient care setting at the bedside. And it can be as simply as bringing your checklist to the bedside and showing that it actually works to improve care on the patient, that they're following the checklist when they're actually doing the procedure on a patient. It also could be just technique, that even without the checklist, that their techniques are better because of the simulations. T3 outcomes are the patient care outcomes that you can look at as a result from your program. So certainly if you reduce central line associated bloodstream infections from a central line insertion training program, that would be a T3 outcome. And then finally, T4 outcomes are those that you did not expect. They're kind of collateral. Did you affect health systems in general? Return on investment is one that we like to show, saving costs to the health system. So if you really think about this, T1 through T4, they kind of align with the Kane and Messick. Can you allude on that a little bit more, Celia?
Sure. So I think when you're looking at the behavior of a learner within a simulation lab, within the actual task that you're having them do, that's really about the instrument that you've actually developed. And I think that really relates to the Kane and Messick steps of checklist development, the content, how your raters are rating your learner within that sort of controlled environment of a simulation lab, for example. When you get to the T2 level, how the learner is then behaving at the patient's bedside, that's very closely related to what Messick, for example, called the relationships to other variables. So are you actually able to change behavior at the bedside? Are they able to more cleanly and efficiently execute a procedure, for example? And that's a great outcome of your curriculum. And then we get into the more higher level outcomes. Jeff, you and others here at Northwestern have done work on this to see that participation in a mastery learning curriculum actually reduces infection rates, actually reduces complications, and potentially another outcome you might look at is readmissions. And those are what you talk about as a T3 outcomes. So it's actually changing those patient outcomes and health outcomes more specifically. And then finally, looking at the T4 outcomes, the change of the actual system. And I think, as you mentioned, the return on investment. So not only are you changing these patient outcomes, but you're actually changing healthcare costs, and you're reducing healthcare costs. And you're able to map backwards the fact that your learners have participated in your curriculum, they've reached a standard, and then going forward, all of these other things are kind of falling into place like dominoes.
So maybe the T3 and T4 outcomes are what Messick called the consequences of assessment use.
Absolutely. I think that maps very nicely onto sort of that stage. And as I mentioned before, that's very, very powerful validity evidence to gather and to show your stakeholders. That's, money talks and health outcomes talk too. And that's a really great thing to be able to show people.
You can't believe still, we've been doing central line insertion data collection since probably 2005, 2006. And until this day, we continue to provide validity evidence. Well, Celia, I love having this conversation. We've had it before, and it's something that's very philosophical, but at the end, I think that it can be simplified and made easy. And I really want to thank you for your interview today. And I learned a lot, and I hope our listeners did as well.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, everybody, thank you for listening today. In the next podcast, I'm going to be interviewing Dr. Diane Wayne, and we're going to get into how we create the minimum passing standard using standard setting exercises for a simulation-based mastery learning curriculum. Bye for now.